Laura E. Adkins joins the show to talk about her essay, I'm a New York City Liberal and I Want a Gun, plus the latest congressional reaction to the July 4th shooting. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and check out our membership options today if you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and stories that you won't find anywhere else. You'll also get early access to this podcast and the opportunity to appear on the show if you want to in one of our members segments or ask questions in one of our Q&A segments. Our last podcast was very popular. People really enjoyed the Q&A, a lot of good questions. So, head over, become a member today if you want to join in on that next time around. But this episode, we're going to be talking about the Bruen decision and some of the fallout from it. And we have a guest who is directly impacted by the decision. Laura Adkins, wrote a piece for the New York Times entitled, I'm a New York City Liberal and I Want a Gun. So welcome to the show. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? Obviously, you wrote this piece for the Times, but that's not your full-time job, right?
Right, correct. I'm the opinion editor at The Forward, which is a Jewish publication. And I mostly cover anti-Semitism and Jewish life and things related to that. But I wrote this piece kind of in reaction to things that had nothing to do with my normal beat. So it was definitely a step outside of my usual writing.
Sure, certainly. And I think you have an interesting perspective, which is why I wanted to bring you on the show, both as somebody who's going to be directly impacted by this ruling, but also somebody who, is on the left side of the aisle, right? And in terms of politics, I think it's always interesting to talk to gun owners or prospective gun owners, in your case, from that side of things, because you're underrepresented oftentimes in gun media. So we try to bring on different voices here. But yeah, can you tell us what made you want to write the piece for the Times?
So a few weeks before the Bruen decision came down, I was in the middle of dealing with a personal situation that I'm sure we'll get into, and was really starting to fear for my safety. And like a lot of people, we don't always think deeply about things until they personally affect us. And I have a close friend who I know went through a lot of hurdles to get a gun when they were living in New Jersey, also for personal protection. And I reached out to her asking for any insight that she had into the process for getting a permit to carry a handgun in New York City. And she laughed at me and basically said, unless you're a celebrity or wealthy and have access to a lawyer who can really advocate on your behalf, that's not going to be a fun process for you to go through. So it honestly was only a few weeks before the Bruen decision came down that I was even interested in the outcome.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think people don't realize how hard it is in these, well, I guess formerly May issue states to actually obtain the permit. I think there's this idea that, all right, well, there's a permit. So, and it's about, you just need to have a good reason, right, to be able to get one. And most people would think, well, if I have, some specific, like I live in a bad neighborhood or I want it for self-defense is a good reason, right, to need to carry a firearm. But those don't qualify under these statutes. And really in practice, what you'll see is they often just aren't issuing very many permits at all. And if they do go in a lot of cases to people like, well, former President Donald Trump had a permit in New York, potentially because he had threats against his life, but also potentially because he was well connected there. There've been a number of scandals in the NYPD's licensing division regarding basically bribery for handgun permits. And you've seen that in California as well. There was a scheme to trade iPads for permits in the Los Angeles area, wow. I believe. And so It's not an uncommon thing. And what you'll see is very low number of permits compared to states that have shall issue permitting laws. Obviously some states have no permits at all, but most states have what New York is going to end up with some form of, which is shall issue. For instance, Maryland just changed their law to comply with the ruling. The governor announced that. Maryland has, according to the Crime Research Center, their Crime Prevention Research Center, they had under 24,000 permits. Whereas Virginia, which is actually where I live, but is a neighboring state that has shall issue permitting, and they have over 750,000 permits that are active. Now, Virginia is a little bit bigger population, about 2 million more people, but if Maryland was issuing at the same rate as Virginia, they would have over 500,000, and they have under 24,000. So it gives you just some numbers there to better explain it. I mean, Florida, which is similar population to New York, they have about 1.2 million permits, whereas New York, there's a couple different estimates I've seen, but it ranges between 35,000 and 80,000 permits active in the state. So, you can see that's the real impact of these laws.
The other really frustrating thing for me, I'm always a data person, and I want to understand how, this process works, what the approval process is like. And there's no good available data in New York City without filing a Freedom of Information request. Even, experts at John Jay College that works very closely on issues of criminal justice pretty much said there's no good data on the approval rate or the exact factors that go into getting approved. So the whole process is very opaque and bureaucratic. Yeah,
absolutely. And that's very common with those sorts of licensing programs. But why don't we talk just real quick, as much as you're comfortable with sharing, obviously you talked about it a bit in the New York Times piece, but what was it in particular that made you want to, obtain a gun and a permit to carry? Obviously you had a personal issue with, former boyfriend, former significant other who was, that relationship ended poorly. And can you just give us a little more background on what happened there?
Sure. So I, like many people, ended a relationship over a year ago. And for several months of the past year, with increasing escalation, my former boyfriend started reaching out to family and friends, trying to get in touch with me, sending very lengthy missives to family and friends. And at first it was kind of more annoying than alarming. And in about April of this year, it got to a level, as I write in my piece, he had gone through my social media and printed out photos of me with friends and had, reached out to my family with what we felt was very alarming messages. And I think we all kind of have a gut sense when things are starting to get dangerous. And this person knows where I live. And this person also was getting served a temporary restraining order. Thankfully, I was out of the country when that happened, but I genuinely did not know how they would react. And I knew that they had a history of erratic behavior. And there's always a balance, of course, between caution and paranoia. But I'm a single woman. I live alone, and I was very concerned about what would happen. I think it ended up making it in the final version of the piece, but I had 2 NYPD officers from their domestic violence unit come to check up on me. I live in a walk-up apartment, like many single New Yorkers, and one of the officers was out of breath by the time they climbed up to my apartment, which, is fine. But I was just thinking, oh my God, if there's an actual emergency here, I'm going to be on my own at least for, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, however long. The response time in New York City, it seems like from 911 calls is at least 3-4 minutes, plus getting up the stairs. So it really hit me in that moment that, I need to have a plan for how I would get out of a bad situation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, so I mean, you had a very serious, specific threat, not necessarily a direct threat to your life in terms of articulated and written down or spoken to you, but obviously a dangerous situation that's developed to the point where you're even able to obtain a restraining order. But so why did you attempt to get a permit? Did you actually file an application with the NYPD, or what was the step there as far as the gun permitting goes?
So I had started the application. The other thing that your listeners should know is that in New York City, the application for a handgun license costs over $300. And, that's a big chunk of change. So I started the application, reached out to the friend who I knew had gone through a similar process in New Jersey. And when she told me that this would basically be throwing money into a process that was very unlikely to be approved, I put it to the wayside and started, dealing with other things. It's absolutely in my plan for this year. But, like others, I want to understand exactly the way to go about it. Now that the Bruen decision has come down, hopefully it'll be a little more clear and easy, but it's still going to be, I want to make clear, it's still going to be like a big process in New York. Yeah.
So is that $300 fee, is that, I know in New York City they have even stricter laws than the rest of the state. And I believe they have a permit just to purchase the handgun first, right? Is that $300 fee for that part, or is
so
that
the permit is for the application fee in general, whether you're applying just to have a handgun in your home or in public, and really public with an asterisk, because they've been clarifying post Bruen decision that pretty much any space where you would be in public and feel unsafe is on the list of places that you're not going to be legally able to carry.
We'll definitely, I definitely want to get your reaction to some of the post Bruen reforms that New York is trying to institute right now. But, or I guess the law already passed. But first, I just want to go through this process, right? So you had this dangerous situation. First of all, when you got the restraining order, did the police give you any sort of indication that might be something that would qualify you to get a concealed carry permit in the city?
So New York City is very bureaucratic in many ways. And the way that's relevant here is that restraining orders, if it is a former partner, are actually not handled by the police department. They're handled by it's called, I believe, the Family Justice Center is one of the organizations. So it's a totally separate system. It's through family court. It's not through the NYPD at all. So anecdotally, I have seen some cases of people using a restraining order as a list that would, or as a reason rather, that would make them potentially eligible for these licenses. But again, it's not really clearly stated anywhere in the application or on the NYPD website, what actually qualifies you.
Right. Yeah, I guess because that's the whole idea, is that it's completely subjective and up to the issuing official, really. Right. So I mean, I know a lot of defenses of these laws are that, well, you have to show you have a good reason. And so, something like a restraining order might be that good reason. But really it is, and you're obviously been started the process at the very least. It really is completely subjective. They don't give you an indication that restraining order is actually going to be able to qualify you for the permit, right?
Right. I think there's a big difference between a burdensome process and a totally opaque process. And while it would be difficult, like there's a ton of steps also to get a restraining order. And I think it's good that people can't just willy-nilly, infringe on other people's rights and ability to communicate with others. But at the same time, there is a clearly delineated process in a way that just isn't the case here.
Right. Yeah. And so that, so ultimately that's where you felt like, going through this process, it was just so unclear and unlikely. It's from what you heard from friends that you would actually make it through, and that's why well. So when you put in for the handgun permit, did you try? You're saying that the permit covers both owning the gun and potentially carrying it on the same application. Is that how it works?
So you choose on the NYPD's clunky old website. It's all handled online now. You basically choose when you start the application whether you're applying just for having it in your home or carry. And there's several other options that I wasn't familiar with. But you're pretty much on your own through that process. Yeah.
Okay. And so did they give you any sort of timetable for how long it might take to, decide on your application?
So I believe it's at minimum, the New York Police Department website states it's at minimum 4 months. Realistically, probably closer to a year, if not more.
Is that another issue for you? I mean, it seems like you're in a pressing situation.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I mentioned in the piece, my stepfather actually sells guns for a part of his work. And I was, asking him how long a background check process, for example, usually takes. And at his particular place of work, they have as long as they need to figure out, if this person passes the background check. I know in some other places there's a time cutoff. That is all to say, I understand the need for some time to make sure that someone applying for this is, not going to be a threat to others. No, though we can never know for certain. But at the same time, my situation and a lot of other people's situations is pretty urgent. So a year is a long time to have to wait for this. I mean, I was very shaken also. About 6 blocks from me last weekend, a woman was shot at point blank range, pushing her infant in a stroller by a former partner that was known to her family as being a dangerous person. I don't know the details of whether or not her family, was constantly badgering the NYPD to follow up on this individual. But I do know from experience that for better, for worse, it usually in these situations is the responsibility of the person who feels targeted to take action to make sure that it's addressed. So there's a lot of onus on, I don't want to say the victim, but there's a lot of onus on the person feeling threatened or feeling a need to empower themselves to be super proactive in a way that sometimes places the burden, at least in my eyes, on the people most at risk of being harmed.
Yeah. I'm interested here as well, because obviously you work at a Jewish publication. And so you deal with anti-Semitism a lot in your coverage, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show. You're somebody who has that specific threat, or at least a specific reason to feel fear for your life at this moment in time right now. Right. And most people don't have something like that. They don't have a restraining order against an ex-partner or whatever. But, there are a lot of general threats to people's safety that exist in the public sphere. Right. And perhaps even elevated risks for members of minority groups, like Jewish people. And so, I'm interested in your take on just that requirement in general. And I know that, for instance, Washington, D.C., they had a total ban on concealed carry. Then that got struck down, and they implemented a New York, Maryland, California style may issue law for a while. And it really functioned in practice more like some California counties where it's may issue, but they'll give you a permit if you have these certain different documents, like a restraining order, for instance. And then that of course got struck down because they would still deny anyone who had just a general desire for self-defense, or who, if they lived in a neighborhood with a high crime rate, or they were, a member of my minority group that suffers hate crimes, like
Right.
Asian people or Jewish people or Black Americans and so forth. But
Mhm.
I don't know, where do you come down on that distinction? Are you
Yeah.
still wanting to see, it's really only people who have a very specific threat that has documented police records behind it, or a restraining order behind it, should be able to get these permits or not?
So I was very struck yesterday, actually. We at the Forward have been covering the situation in Highland Park really intensely because it's a heavily Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there was a devastating shooting over the weekend. And my colleague spoke to a local synagogue in the area that was next door to where the shooter grew up. And the head of security mentioned actually that the alleged shooter had kind of cased out the synagogue and had been inside of the synagogue. And the security official also mentioned that there were individuals in the congregation who were armed and who carried openly. And, it's been a huge debate within the Jewish community over the past several years with anti-Semitism really on the rise. I'm sure for other minority communities as well. There's, culturally, most Jewish Americans are pretty liberal. And there's a big reluctance to, guns are not really a part of Jewish American culture for most of us. And a lot of people really started to take seriously. I know my synagogue had trainings on personal safety, and there's been a ton of investment in security. And a lot of people are feeling much more vulnerable and, asking themselves whether or not carrying is something that they should be doing. I really think that everyone should have the opportunity to safely defend themselves. And that's going to look different in different parts of the country. I personally would be uncomfortable with people in New York City who, aren't well trained on how to use a handgun,
Sure.
Trying to go Rambo on defending their turf. But, the reality is there were over 50 people shot in New York City over the 4th of July weekend. And we have very tight gun laws here, but there's a ton of guns here. And I would much rather have a slightly larger percentage of the population really thinking about personal safety and security and, looking into how to properly carry a firearm than leaving it to, just people with the worst of intentions being the ones armed.
Right. Yeah. There's certainly something you hear from a lot of carry advocates. And sorry. It sounds like you're comfortable with the shall issue standard, where maybe most states now actually have no permit requirement at all, as long as you can legally own a firearm, you can legally carry it in 25 states. But the remaining states all have what's called shall issue, which requires a background check and some level of training. That varies from state to state, but as long as you pass those qualifications, you're able to obtain the rifle. There isn't this special subjective standard beyond that for whether you have a good need or, obviously some of the states that previously had the may issue laws are trying to institute workarounds. Basically, you're seeing California, for instance, is removing its good reason clause and emphasizing its good moral character clause, which is kind of maybe hard to tell a difference between the two. And I don't know how well that's going to stand up in court. But speaking of which, New York now. So now Bruen has happened, right? The New York's law, the good reason clause, has been struck down as unconstitutional. But obviously, that doesn't mean that now New York politicians are embracing, gun rights rhetoric and repealing all of their gun laws, right? Instead, they're passing different kinds of restrictions. They're trying to find the new, boundary for what they can do constitutionally. And so one of the main things they're doing now is it seems you're going to be more likely to actually obtain the permit, but they've taken the approach of declaring a lot of places as sensitive places and off limits for guns, basically gun-free zones. And they've taken the approach of it's sort of a novel approach. No one else has tried this yet, but they want to make all businesses off limits unless the business itself posts a sign saying that you can carry there, which would, I think in practice, is likely to make most of the city off limits to carrying your firearm. I think the governor, in fact, was quoted as saying that maybe a few streets you'd be able to carry, but that's about it. And I think they're banning it in the entirety of Times Square. They're just instituting a lot of these sort of restrictions. So you're likely to be able to get the permit now, but you may not be able to carry your gun many places. Like the public transit, for instance, will be off limits under this new law as well. So I don't know. Is there a practical difference in your mind now? Or like, how are you reacting to these new restrictions?
It's frustrating that when it comes to the crime conversation in general in New York City, a lot of the loudest voices are the people genuinely and generally least affected. I know, during and now mid and after the pandemic, I ride the subway, and it used to be super safe any time of day and night. And, my friends and I are not super comfortable anymore riding the subway after a certain time of day. And is that always reflected in the statistics that the NYPD releases? Not necessarily. But I think a lot of those who are either refusing to believe that there's a significant problem of rising violence in the city are just people that have never genuinely been afraid in the city and are very insulated from what's happening. When you scroll through the pictures of the victims' families from the 50 people shot in New York City, most of them live in areas that are heavily minority communities, are poorer sections of the city. And the fact that, this permit process, I have the resources financially to apply for it. I have the time to fill out this lengthy application. And I don't know the circumstances of the woman who was killed a few blocks from me last weekend, but I just keep thinking about her. Did she have the resources to get a gun if she had wanted to? Was she able to go through all of this red tape if she had wanted to? It takes a lot of time and resources to secure yourself in the city. And, those who live in nice neighborhoods are much more insulated by default. So I sometimes get frustrated when I speak to people who, grew up in a wealthy area of the country and have never, lived somewhere where, for example, the police take 10 to 15 minutes or more to come, and you really are on your own if there's an emergency situation, or have never lived in a building where you need to make sure that no one's behind you when you open the front door. And I certainly understand why people who have not been around guns are afraid of them. I think that's very real. And I certainly don't think that people who are skeptical of more guns on the streets, even with responsible holders, I don't think that they have bad reasons for making the points that they do. But I do feel that the conversation is a little bit detached from the experience of the most vulnerable people in this city.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. This was actually one of the points raised in a brief to the court from New York public defenders that essentially argued that for young black men in New York City, there is no such thing as the Second Amendment. They just don't have Second Amendment rights because of the reasons you just laid out there. It's exceedingly difficult to actually legally obtain a firearm. and carry it in New York. And so people who live in more dangerous areas, even if they aren't criminals themselves, they just interested in protecting themselves. It's basically impossible to do that legally. And so many will choose to violate the law rather than risk, getting killed by somebody else who doesn't care about those laws, right?
Right.
In the first place. And so, you've seen the same. It's interesting because stop and frisk was very controversial, right? But stop and frisk was enforcing this gun law. It was enforcing the licensing laws for having handguns in New York City. That's why they were frisking people. There's the main point, drugs and guns, but often people were arrested for just having a firearm, not having, the police didn't have any evidence that they were looking to commit any other crimes with the gun other than just having it on them. And so, I do think that is a section of the story that often gets left aside, even when we're discussing disparate outcomes of criminal justice enforcement in the United States. Gun laws are often left off that list of talking points. So I think it's a legitimate point. But real quick here, just at the little bit of time we got left, I do want to. So you haven't actually purchased any firearms yet, right?
Correct.
But so what are I'm interested as somebody who's looking to make this their first purchase. What are your how is that going for you? I know you've been shooting a couple of times. You talked about that on your social media. How's that process going? What's it been like looking for the right firearm for you?
So I am very lucky because, again, my stepfather does sell guns as a part of his work and is super knowledgeable. I grew up hunting with my stepdad, but I've never really handled handguns. It was always rifles. So I am going to approach this process with a very open mind in terms of what gun I actually get. But I think, like the majority of women, I'm looking for, something that I can handle confidently and easily, that I can learn how to make second nature in case, God forbid, I need to use it. And, just based on the accessibility of guns here, I honestly wouldn't even know where to go to buy a gun in New York. I would probably try out models the next time I'm at home in Missouri and, be somewhere where that's another obstacle here is in New York City, there's not exactly a culture of a lot of people who are interested in, sportsmanship and marksmanship and safely training people to handle a handgun. So that's also something that is very important to me to be a part of this process. So as much as getting the gun itself will hopefully provide a little sense of relief, I think also, finding the resources to be able to safely handle it and confidently handle it and have others to support is another part of this process.
Yeah, well, I know that we have listeners up in New York, so hopefully some of them maybe can reach out to you and offer some help on that front. Obviously, there are a number of advocacy groups that operate up there. I think the Liberal Gun Club has a chapter in New York. They might be a fit for you, given just based off the title of the piece, right?
Right.
That you identify as a liberal, so you're not the only liberal who wants to own firearms or owns firearms in the United States. That's for sure. And then, of course, there are a number of shooting links for women in particular, but there's lots of just general shooting clubs too that exist out there. I think the city makes it more difficult to open ranges, so there aren't a huge variety of them, but they do exist. Unlike in Washington, D.C., where you have to go outside the city to get to a shooting range. But yeah, no, I mean, that's exciting. I think it's, I think hopefully some of our readers maybe and some of our listeners can offer you support on that front. I'm always happy to help in whatever way I can as well. But I'm interested in as well in the reaction that you're seeing from publishing this op-ed. I mean, it's the New York Times. It's you're identifying yourself as a liberal who wants a gun. That's not a super common thing to see in the op-ed pages of the New York Times. So what have people been saying to you?
So they always say not to read the comments when you publish something that's personal. I never listened to that advice, for better or for worse. And I've actually been pleasantly surprised. There have, of course, been reactions. People, I got one that said, you're making up your story. I got a few that, said you're much less safe with a gun than without a gun. I'm fine for people to dispute the data. That's not a big deal. I don't take it personally, rather.
Sure.
But I have had an astonishing number of, both close friends and just acquaintances, many of whom are also pretty liberal, just say like, wow, you made me think about this in a new way. Didn't know you were experiencing this, and I've never thought of this aspect of this conversation. So overall, I worked with an amazing editor who really pushed me to add a lot of the data to anchor my argument beyond just my personal experience. And overall, I've been very pleasantly surprised.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I think people, if they're not well versed in how these licensing laws work in practice, they sound reasonable on the face of them, right? Because, yeah, sure, you should need a good reason to carry a gun, right? But the problem comes in what that standard means in practice, which is basically that nobody gets given this approval because, it's a completely subjective judgment as to whether or not you have a good reason to need to carry a firearm. I think a lot of people would think, well, being Jewish and living in a city where there are often anti-Semitic attacks would be a good reason, or being a single woman, even without everything else, could be a good reason why you would need a gun to defend yourself against an aggressor in New York City. But that's not how these things work in real life. And so I think it's important to explain that and to have people understand and to see real world examples of how it impacts people in real life. So really appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective and your story. I think that a lot of our listeners will really enjoy it. So I really appreciate it. Where can people find more of your work, by the way?
So all of my writing is available on my website, which is just myname.com. My publication is forward, like the direction.com, where I'm the opinion editor, and I hang out on Twitter. And my direct messages are open, for better or worse. So I think that's how we connected. I'm always happy to speak to people on there as well.
Well, you've been wonderful. Really, really appreciate you taking the time. So, and hopefully maybe we could have you back on again when you are actually able to, finish the process of obtaining your gun and getting your permit. And we can see, how have these changes in law affected that process? How's it all going from somebody who actually has gone through it?
Great. Yeah, I would love that. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's that time of the week again. We're here to do the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman and joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are you today, Steve?
I'm doing all right. We're filming this out of order, so this is actually the last part of the podcast, but I'm filming it before I film the main interview. So it's like a time warp thing going on.
Sure.
In fact, I might have a haircut. I don't know. We'll see if I have time to do that. That'll be fun.
Complete outfit change.
Yeah, it'll be like a movie where they denote the time change by having the characters change their hair and outfits. But yeah, we'll see. I'm doing good though. I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Can't complain. Got some big news in the gun world this week. Obviously, there was a very tragic mass shooting over the holiday weekend in Highland Park. Which, of course, as a lot of these shootings tend to do, sort of reignited the discussion of gun politics again. And the timing of that is very interesting just because we're coming off of a big federal gun control legislation, the first in many, many years. And it's already reignited new conversations. And we have a story from Eric Eva, one of our interns here. If you want to dive into a little bit more of the details there.
Yeah, so the story is basically just the Democratic reaction to the July 4th shooting, which is along the lines of what you might expect. You know, they basically say that the bipartisan gun bill was a good start, but clearly insufficient in the face of this new shooting, which is, essentially what a lot of gun rights folks had predicted would be the case. And to be fair to Democrats, they all along, many of them were saying that this wasn't the end goal for them. It doesn't have most of their top priorities in it, like an assault weapons ban or magazine bans or universal background checks or policies of that nature. It obviously focused more on, funding for red flag laws, which Illinois already has one, but that wasn't used in this case. Again, there's sort of another unfortunate failure because there were a lot of red flags in this case, just like in Buffalo, but it wasn't something that people followed up on, unfortunately. And it sort of seems like the family went the opposite direction and helped this person obtain firearms after they had made a series of threats. But regardless, the bill focused on trying to prevent people who have domestic violence history towards their dating partners or who have a juvenile criminal record from getting guns. So there's a different approach than what most Democrats want. And so all along they were saying this was sort of the first step. And now the next significant mass shooting that we've seen, they're now calling for more gun control, of course. So, for instance, the president himself, President Joe Biden, said, I recently signed the first major bipartisan gun reform legislation in almost 30 years into law, which includes actions that will save lives. But there's much more work to do, and I'm not going to give up fighting the epidemic of gun violence. Tammy Duckworth said, last month Congress approved that bipartisan gun compromises on gun safety are possible. Today proved that we can't stop there. Senator Murphy, who is one of the key negotiators in the bipartisan gun deal, he said, we have broken the back of the gun lobby. We now have made possible changes in our gun laws that can keep our communities safer. Today is a reminder that we still have a long road to travel. So, he called it just the beginning. And obviously that's in line with what a lot of the critiques from gun rights advocates were at the time, which is that as soon as there's another shooting, there would just be, calls for new legislation. And so that's what we're seeing. But whether that actually materializes into new legislation is another question, of course.
Right.
So we haven't seen that yet. Most of these calls are for assault weapons bans.
Right.
So that seems very unlikely.
I was going to say, I think the odds of that are slim to none because we're getting ever closer to what's shaping up to be a pretty contentious midterms, especially one where they predict to be a fairly sizable red wave because it is, an off year with a Democrat in the White House, plus some things in the economy are pointing to a potential big win for Republicans. It seems like an assault weapons ban. We've covered pretty recently here, just the way the politics of assault weapons bans have been shaping up lately makes that already kind of unlikely. Yeah. But with those electoral factors, man, I don't know if I see a real big push after all the political capital that was spent just getting this last bipartisan bill across the finish line.
Yeah. And it gets to the point where that was always the question with the previous bill, the political calculation. Who's this for? Like, who's this benefiting in terms of the politics of it? Right. Because as soon as there's another mass shooting, it's just going to appear like a half measure to a lot of the people who want more gun control, right?
Sure.
And it's going to appear like a betrayal to the people who don't want more gun control. So, I guess the calculation was to try and hit that sort of middle zone of people who might generally favor stricter gun laws in some circumstances, but aren't really gun control activists necessarily, and they aren't gun rights activist either. So I guess the cool question is, like, if you keep having mass shootings like this, if it doesn't actually produce a noticeable decrease in either mass shootings or violent crime generally, gun crime generally, is that going to be a political winner for any of the people involved? I mean, certainly it's probably a bigger question for the Republicans who passed it, because they're the ones taking more of a political risk, I would imagine. You know, the Democrats can say, as they're saying now, that, well, it's a start, you know, it's something that we got done at least, but we want to do much more. Even if there's doesn't seem to be any bill materializing right now. I've talked to several sources, Republican sources on the Hill, and they don't see appetite for a new gun bill at this point.
Right.
You know, we're planning to do a follow-up piece on the Republicans' reactions. There haven't been a lot of public reactions, that, at least not in the type that talk about legislation, right? So it seems unlikely that you're going to get another bipartisan gun bill through before the midterms happen.
Yeah, particularly in the Senate.
Yeah, and especially because the things that would be in a new bill are going to be more controversial.
Absolutely.
Much more controversial, I would imagine. Like an assault weapons ban is far more controversial than what's in the current the law that was just signed. As much as there's plenty of things in there that are controversial, an assault weapons ban or universal background checks those are the big ticket items. And
I think, it is fair to, I think it's worth noting, and it's only fair to point out that this shooting took place in Illinois, where universal background checks are law of the land. There's an ID, a FOID purchasing permit law.
Yeah,
there's an assault weapons ban.
Firearm owner identification card, which is basically a permit to purchase guns.
Right. And there's an assault weapons ban in the town where this happened. There's a high capacity magazine ban in the town where this happened. And by all accounts that we've seen in reporting so far, he obtained this gun legally somehow. So it's just all these different, basically all the legislative items on the wish list that are being called for right now were already the law of the land in this shooting, I think, which just makes the political dynamics here all the more disfavorable to Democrats getting an actual bill, because Republicans can just say, look what happened here in Illinois. Your proposals didn't work. So
the only problem with that is you could have made the same argument about the bill that did pass, because none of the things in that bill would have had any effect on the Uvalde shooting.
Sure.
That it was responding to. Maybe it's vaguely related in some ways because of the age of the shooter, and some of these reforms targeted people by their age, but none of them, it appears, would have prevented him from buying a gun.
Sure.
And that's the other problem. Like, yeah, the red flag law failed in Illinois, and their FOID card system failed to stop this shooter from getting guns, but that's primarily because people didn't use those systems. Now, maybe the police should have done something. He had a 2019 incident where he had threatened to kill his family, and he had his knives confiscated, I guess. And then later on, his father co-signed on his FOID card for minors, or for anyone, not minors, anyone under 21. In Illinois, you have to have a co-signer for the period where you're under 21. But he didn't commit the shooting until he was 22.
Right.
So this was years later, and it's unclear outside of an actual conviction or involuntary commitment, which both are potentially could have happened. The police have been called for two different incidents from what's been reported. One was suicidal ideation, and so perhaps he could have been involuntarily committed over that, although that's obviously not a super common response to somebody having suicidal thoughts. So, I don't know how realistic that is. But then later, they were called back because he had threatened to kill his family, and obviously he was doing a lot of things in his social media presence, including he had a music career where he alluded to shootings and being killed there obviously are red flags in the history of the shooter, but again, with a lot of these, as with a lot of these shooters, including Uvalde, had red flags as well. I think there were reports about him threatening women and animal abuse, but these things are all potential disqualifiers if they're followed up on.
Right.
And oftentimes they're not. And that's where you get into the real problems. And it can be hard for a family, I'm sure, with somebody who's having mental health struggles to, take those necessary steps, because I'm sure they're hoping that there's a less severe path to solving the problem, right? So I don't want to underplay how difficult it is to actually stop these sorts of attacks in real life. A lot of this is hindsight, being pretty clear when you pile up a lot of things over years. But that's one of the weaknesses of a red flag system or involuntary commitment, or even, a system based on convictions for prohibiting people from purchasing guns. Because if you might have an incident that in hindsight it's clear was a red flag and something that should have been done about it, but at the time might have, a lot of people are, Buffalo shooter's another one where he was taken by police after making, a threat while at school, and it wasn't necessarily a specific threat. It was a generalized threat of violence, and he was taken for a mental health evaluation and apparently was cleared, was not, and for whatever reason that didn't, they're still unclear on why that didn't constitute an involuntary commitment. I guess it's a different legal process they were using for that evaluation. But, the goal in those situations is usually not to put somebody behind bars or try to permanently affect their life. Usually the goal is to try and help them and rehabilitate them. And so that's why you'll see people slip through the cracks like this. And it's much more infuriating in hindsight, knowing what they did, right, what they went on to do. But most people don't go on to do those sorts of things. And so it's hard. It's very hard to prevent these sort of things. We had a whole podcast a while back with Professor James Allen Fox, who tracks mass shootings for the Associated Press. And we talked through a lot of different proposals and their strengths and weaknesses. That's the reality of all these things, is there's strengths and weaknesses to all policy positions that you put out there for how to stop these sorts of events, which do remain statistically very rare, as much as they are. Obviously, any single incident is going to be too many. Nobody wants any of these to happen ever. The question is, how do you stop them? And that's where you get into a lot of trade-offs,
right?
Whether it's with the effectiveness of the policy or the burden on large swaths of people to try and prevent one person from doing something, or a tiny percentage of people from doing something. That's the issues you face here. But anyway, I've gotten us a little bit off track with that. I don't believe there's no bill that's floating around yet. All we've really heard as far as specifics of what Democrats want are basically an assault weapons ban. That's right. What in the story, the specific policy that's been touched on by some of these Democrats,
right? Particularly Illinois Democrats, and like we said, just the way that this all works out, and the fact that in this shooting, like the last few shootings you rattled off, there were missed opportunities to use existing laws. I think this just all works in the favor of those that don't want to see more legislation, and I think we are unlikely to see a formal bill actually advanced.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's just, I mean, the Senate doesn't move that fast on this kind of stuff, especially when they just passed the reform. I think most of them would argue that they want to see how that plays out, and that they all understand it wouldn't stop every single mass shooting. The hope or their goal was to decrease the number and try to have some effect with a policy that doesn't go as far as in the restrictions, into restrictions as perhaps it could have. This is a compromise. This is something where they had to find some common ground, even though they couldn't get a majority of Republicans to back it, but they did get 15, which is quite a lot in the Senate. It's actually, they only got 14 in the House, which is fascinating. But either way, it seems very unlikely that they're going to immediately go back to that well, even with another mass shooting occurring.
Yeah, I think that's right. But
and look, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. After you.
I just like we're stuck at a door.
Yeah.
You go first. No, I was just going to say, like, we're at there've been 7 of these mass shootings this year, according to the Mother Jones tracker, which is 3 or more dead with an element of randomness to the attack in public. So no gang-related shootings,
right,
or other shootings of that nature. Yeah, a lot, actually, most mass shootings where somebody kills 3 or more people, unfortunately, are events where somebody murders their whole family in their own home. So it's obviously a different problem, but that doesn't get tracked in these in the Mother Jones counts. And it also does. Most of the media counts are 3 or more people shot, or 3 or 4, depends on which account you're looking at. But so that's obviously a much broader statistic that incorporates all sorts of different kinds of shootings. Most of them are gang-related shootings, or crime-related in some way, drugs or gangs or what have you. But the Mother Jones one, I think, is a much better metric. It gets you down to what most people would probably consider a mass shooting in the average person's mind, which is something similar to Uvalde or Buffalo or this shooting in Illinois. And so there have been 7 of those this year, which really puts us back on track with what we've been seeing the pre-pandemic years, much higher than back in the 80s or 90s, but we're likely to see probably another 4 or 5 before the end of this year, unfortunately, if the averages keep. And it seems like we're getting back to what is unfortunately a normal pace for these events in recent in like the last decade or so, taking out there were only 2 in 2020, but I don't think our solution to mass shootings is going to be locking everyone down in their homes. So we have to find other ways of preventing these attacks. But it's one of those sad things that came back once the pandemic alleviated and people were gathering in crowds again, and you had we have not solved the issue clearly. Right. But yes, you're likely to see renewed calls for new gun control after mass shootings going forward. I think you're unlikely to see another federal bill before the midterms.
I think that's right. But if there is a bill or any other big gun news, where can they go, Steve, to find out about that?
Yes, you can head to thereload.com. We will, of course, be covering it in a sober, serious way, trying to give you the best insight possible into what's going on in DC with gun laws and across the country as well. But yeah, that's all we've got for this week. If you want to head over and check out our membership options, you should do that today over at thereload.com. If you join, you will get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and news stories that you cannot find anywhere else on the planet. I promise you that. You'll also get this podcast a day early. You'll get the opportunity to appear on the podcast or ask questions on our next Q&A. Those Q&A episodes are very popular. So, if you want to be the person asking the questions, and we've had, as Jake said last episode, we had some very smart, very intelligent questions, and hopefully we did a good job in trying to respond to them all. But, join today and you can ask a question in the next one we do. So, but that's it for now. We will see you guys next week.